And welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and this is 10 criminally underplayed cards in Commander. This is a unique list that I'm doing where, there's a lot of cards that fall into this void of cards that I don't typically talk about. Like my 10 cards you should be putting in your Commander decks videos mostly concentrate on older cards, right? And so the cards that have sort of popped up in the last couple of years before my channel started, because obviously since my channel started, I've had an opportunity to talk about all the new cards that come out, but there's a bit of a gap there between the older cards that I talk about or oldish cards that I talk about on my 10 cards video and the cards that I've talked about already on my channel because they've come out since I've had my channel. So this list includes those cards. These are cards that have come out in the last couple of years that I can't believe they don't get played more. The inspiration from this came from Hero of Bredegard, which I mentioned on my 10 cards video, which is a card that I think should be in way more decks than it is. And I thought, well, why not go and just make a whole list of cards that have come out in the last couple of years that I think deserve way more play in the format. But getting to the list, coming in at number 10, Witch of the Moors. 3 black, human warlock, 4/4 with death touch. But more importantly, at the beginning of your end step, if you gained life this turn, each opponent sacrifices a creature and you return up to 1 target creature from your graveyard to your hand. That's a fantastic ability, and all you have to do to trigger it is gain life. Any amount of life, 1 will do. This is currently in under 4,000 decks, and I know people will say, okay, well, they've seen this card around, and 4,000, that's kind of a lot of decks, but it should be in so many more, because there is so many commanders in black that are gaining life. So Ayara, First of the Lochthwain, should be an auto-include in that deck. All you have to do is have a black creature enter the battlefield on your turn, and then that will trigger at the beginning of the end step. Right? The less obvious ones, though, Bontu the Glorified. Bontu is already going to be in a little bit of an aristocrats theme. You're sacking your creatures, but when you sacrifice your creatures, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life, right? That's something that people really don't think about when they build that deck. You're gaining life almost assuredly on your turn every single turn, so that's going to trigger your Witch of the Moors. Kardur Doomscourge, despite being a Rakdos commander, actually gains you life. Whenever an attacking creature dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So if one of your attacking creatures dies on your turn, which is probably likely, you're going to trigger your Witch of the Moors. I think it goes in that deck as well. Cridle of Baldur's Gate. There's a Dimir commander that is gaining life. Again, something that you don't really typically think about when you build this deck, but whenever Cridle of Baldur's Gate deals combat damage to a player, that player loses 1 life, mills a card, and you gain 1 life and scry 1. So again, there's that gain 1 life. That's all we need in order to trigger our Witch of the Moors. So I think this card can go in a lot more decks than it currently is in. Coming in at number 9, Birth of Meletis. 1 and a white enchantment saga. When it enters the battlefield, you search your library for basic plains card, reveal it, and put it in your hand, then shuffle your library. So it's a, land dig effect, right? It's not ramp, it's just putting a plains into your hand. So it's great that way. A lot of decks that have white are going to be putting effects like that in there anyway. And then on the second one, you're going to create an 0/4 wall artifact creature token with Defender, which is great. So nice little blocker for you early in the game. Also happens to be an artifact creature. That can be relevant as well. I think it definitely can go in any deck, like an Oswald deck where you want to be sacrificing artifacts maybe. And then the third one, you gain 2 life. And this is one of the reasons why I have it in my Patron of the Kitsune deck, because of that gain life trigger. All that other stuff is great, right? So searching for the plains card's always going to be good. Having a blocker is going to be good. Gaining life's going to be good. But some of those things fit better into certain decks, right? Like the gain life trigger, I'm going to want in my Patron of the Kitsune deck because I have lots of those if you gain life effects in that deck. So it's a perfect fit there, on top of the fact that it is an enchantment that then goes to your graveyard. So it can go in an enchantment tribal deck. It can go in a Lurus deck because you can then play it again from your graveyard. Really should see a lot more play, I think. Coming in at number 8, Nightveil Predator. Blue, black, 3/3 vampire. Flying, death touch, hexproof. So that is such a magical combination of abilities, I think, that you don't see ever. I think this is the only creature in the entire game that has that combination of abilities. I had this in a Rayami deck that I had briefly, of course, because it has a whole bunch of keyword abilities on it. So it's great in that deck. And the issue I found, though, in that deck was that I wanted it to die and it wasn't dying. It was just sitting there. Because it has hexproof, my opponents can't target it. And because it has death touch, my opponents opponents don't want to attack into it or block it. So of course it's absolutely fantastic in any deck where you want to be connecting all the time because it has flying and death touch. But more to the point, it is almost a faux ghostly prison in a way where it just keeps people from attacking you. Or maybe No Mercy is a better example. This would sit on the table and nobody would attack me. Nobody wanted anything to do with my Night Veil Predator because of course it has death touch, and because it has flying, it can block flying creatures as well. And because it has hexproof, my opponents can't just remove it so that they can attack into me. This is a really great card that you could put in any deck, I think. Only in a little over 1,000 decks on EDH Rec right now. Coming in at number 7, Confounding Conundrum. 1 in a blue. Enchantment. When Confounding Conundrum enters the battlefield, draw a card. So right away, that's great. It replaces itself. It's never going to be a dead draw. But I don't think it ever is going to be a dead draw anyway, because this ability, whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, if that player had another land enter the battlefield under their control this turn, they return a land they control to owner's hand. So basically what that means, I mean, first of all, it's only going to affect your opponents. Doesn't affect you at all. You could put this in a Tatiova deck, just go crazy with the ramping, and this won't affect you even a little bit. But more importantly, it hoses other people's lands deck, and of course those are really popular in the format. But even like a fetch land, right? Your opponent plays a fetch land and then cracks it. They've already played a land this turn, and when they go get that land that they're fetching for and put it into play, this is going to trigger and they're going to have to return it to their hand, or a land at least to their hand. It really hoses anyone from ramping. I mean, ramping is so common in the format, and for all the people out there complaining that green is so powerful in the format because of all the ramping it is doing, all those people should be playing this card because it completely hoses that. Coming in at number 6, Generous Patron. 2 in a green, Elf Advisor, 1/4. When Generous Patron enters the battlefield, support 2, which means you put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 other target creatures. Whenever you put 1 or more counters on a creature you don't control, draw a card. So this is an auto include in certain decks, like a Hapatra deck, for example. You're putting -1/-1 counters on all your opponent's creatures. You're going to draw a card for that. You know, it's in 4,000 decks currently, so I imagine it's in all the Hapatra decks. As I talked about in my Volroth deck tech that I did on my personal deck techs video, it's fantastic in there for the same reason, because you're putting those -1/-1 counters and a lot of other counters on your opponent's creatures. It's an auto include in that deck as well. However, if we just get away from that for a second, if you think about it this way, when this card enters the battlefield, you support 2, so you can put a +1/+1 counter on 2 of your opponent's creatures, any 2 of your opponent's creatures, and they can just be a creature that you know is never going to benefit from the +1/+1 counter, like a Soul Warden or something. Any creature you know your opponent is never going to attack with, so it doesn't really matter if it has a counter on it. You can even do it to make a friend and do it a little bit politics if you want, but ultimately this card reads, when it enters the battlefield, draw 2 cards. And that is really, really good for a 3-mana creature, I think. You could put this in damn near any deck, and when it enters the battlefield, you put 2 +1/+1 counters on random opponent's creatures and draw 2 cards. That's really fantastic. I think this can go in a ton of decks. Coming in at number 5, Stunning Reversal. 3 and a black instant. The next time you would lose the game this turn, instead draw 7 cards, and your life total becomes 1. Exile, Stunning Reversal. This is just such a fun card. When I first saw it, I thought people would be playing this card like crazy. Again, only in about 1,000 or so decks on EDH Rec. I've never seen it in a game myself. I had stuck this in my Egon deck because there is lots of those you lose the game effects in that deck. So if they happen to trigger, you can cast this in response, and the next time you would lose the game, instead you draw 7 cards and your life total becomes 1. I mean, it's not great, but it's better than being dead, right? I just think this is a super fun card in a commander game where your opponent's about to run you over with that giant crater hoof attack, and cast this in response, draw 7 cards, and your life total becomes 1. I think that's pretty darn good. It's even better in a deck like a Selenia deck where you want your life total to become 1 so that you can cast that Repay in Kind, so might be a great addition in there as well. Just a really fun card. I'm surprised I don't see it more in the format. Coming in at number 4, Dryad Greenseeker. 1 and a green Dryad, 1/3. Tap to look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you may reveal it and put it into your hand. I really like this card. Again, another card that is in just over 1,000 decks on EDH Rec. I think people look at this and go, oh, well, it goes in a lands theme maybe, and I think it probably does. I like this card, for all the reasons I talk about where I don't like Oracle of Moldiah, how it's revealing the top card of your library so that everyone can see. This just lets you look at the top card of your library. So if you just forget about the rest of this, this is a card that you can just tap to look at the top card of your library if for whatever reason you want to know what's on top. And wouldn't you know, if it happens to be a land card, you can just put it into your hand. So if you combine this with something like, say, a Sensei's Divining Top or a Mary's Guile or something that lets you rearrange the top of your library, now you can very easily make sure there's a land on top of your library so that Dryad Greenseeker can then get it off the top of your library. I think this card could go in way more decks. You could literally put it in any deck and it's always going to be usable. Just look at the top card of your library, then you know what's on top. And if it happens to be a land, you can put it into your hand. Great card. Coming in at number 3, Nightmare Unmaking. 3 black sorcery. Choose one. Exile each creature with power greater than the number of cards in your hand, or exile each creature with power less than the number of cards in your hand. I really like this card. This has become my go-to board wipe for black. This is second. For me, behind Toxic Deluge, this is the second best board wipe in black, I think. I know people like Damnation. And it definitely is, efficient. 4 mana, destroy all creatures that can't be regenerated. It's pretty good. 1 more mana, though, and you get to exile creatures. I like the modal. The modal can be a downside where maybe you want to get rid of all the creatures. I find it's not that difficult to hit exactly what you want, right? You can cast cards in your hand to get to the number you want before you cast this. I really like modal cards myself. It can be a complete blowout sometimes where I don't have a lot of cards in my hand and I exile all of my opponent's creatures and I get to keep mine because they have a low power. I just think it's a fantastic board wipe, only in about 2,700 decks on EDH Rec right now. And again, for me, I think this is probably the second best black board wipe behind Toxic Deluge. Coming in at number 2, Road of Return. Green, sorcery. Choose one. Return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. There's something that every deck is going to want to do every single game. Or put your commander into your hand from the command zone. There's something that almost every deck is going to want to do every single game. And also you can entwine it. So you can pay 2 and do both. So for 4 mana, you can return a permanent card from your graveyard to your hand and put your commander into your hand from the command zone. This is shockingly only in about 3,300 decks on EDH Rec. The fact that it can go in every single deck, to me, I can't believe it. This is another card that I saw when it first came out and thought, this just goes in every deck, right? Doesn't it? I can't believe it's only in 3,300 decks. So I have this in my Questing Beast deck because I want my commander. And if it dies a few times, now I can put it into my hand from the command zone rather than paying the commander tax. And if I wanted to entwine it, let's get something out of my graveyard as well. It's extra good in my A Name is One deck because I need my commander to be in my hand and not in the command zone. But really can go in any deck where you have a green commander that you want to be having in play all the time. I mean, you could even just throw this in an Atraxa deck because an Atraxa deck typically wants to have your commander in play and it's green and people are going to want to get it off the board. Muldrotha, there's another green commander that you are going to want in play all the time that people are probably going to be wanting to remove all the time. I just can't believe this card isn't in more decks. Coming in at number 1 is Chandra's Incinerator, 5 and a red elemental 6/6. This spell costs X less to cast, where X is the total amount of non-combat damage dealt to your opponents this turn. Has trample, and whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, Chandra's Incinerator deals that much damage to target creature or planeswalker that player controls. This card is just an auto-include in so many decks, I think. It's in 4,200 decks currently on EDH Rec. That's not nearly enough because there is a ton of commanders for which it is an auto-include. Yes, it goes in a Teralf God of Fury deck. It goes in a Torbrand deck, right? Any deck where you're probably going to be dealing lots of non-combat damage to your opponents. It is an absolute auto-include in a Purphoros deck. If you got a Purphoros deck, Chandra's Incinerator is going in there for sure because all you have to do is have a creature enter the battlefield. That's going to do 2 damage to each opponent. That's 6 damage that your opponents have gotten this turn, and your Chandra's Incinerators are only going to cost 1 red mana, and then every time you trigger your Purphoros, you're now dealing damage to your opponents and picking off their creatures as well. Just an auto-include in that deck. Fantastic in a Clothis deck as well, where again, you do 2 damage to each opponent, so it's only going to cost 1 mana, and then every time you do that ability, again, it's going to hit their creatures as well. Auto include in a Brian Stout Arm deck, where you are sacrificing another creature and dealing damage equal to its power to target player. So again, that's non-combat damage, and however much damage that is, now you can hit one of their creatures as well. Browlin Skyshark Rider is another commander that is dealing non-combat damage to your opponents. Captain Ripley Vance is another commander that can deal non-combat damage to your opponents. Heartless Hitsugo certainly is dealing a whole lot of non-combat damage to your opponents. This is another one that I think it's an auto include in. You're going to deal like, what, 10, 20 damage to your opponents, and now you can just pick off their biggest creature as well. Fantastic in that deck. I already mentioned it in a couple of my deck techs for Hazoret the Fervent, where I think it's probably an auto include there because of that ability where you can deal 2 damage to each of your opponents. And it is definitely an auto include in an Extus deck, or the backside anyway, Awaken the Blood Avatar, if you're making those tokens, those 3/6 black and red avatar creature tokens with haste, whenever they attack, they deal 3 damage to each opponent. So again, that's non-combat damage. It's going to deal 3 damage to a creature of each of theirs as well. Absolutely fantastic in that deck. Again, it's in a fair amount of decks, and I think people definitely know this card exists. It's not a hidden secret or anything like that. I'm just shocked that it's not in more decks. It's just an auto include in at least 7 or 8 different commander decks, I think. So I'm surprised it doesn't see more play. But that is it for today. That is 10 criminally underplayed cards in the format. Go check your decks, see if you got them in there. If you don't, try to find room, because you will not regret it. But that is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.